Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the special business meeting for the Council for the District of Squamish for Tuesday, November 17th. We're meeting, as always, on the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. Squalin, Please Lat Squamish, Oameo. And we're joined today by Chris's mustache. So it's a special day. Motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Councillor French, seconded by Councillor Herford. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries. As always, we have to adopt Ministerial Order M192. Today, we are ensuring openness, transparency, accessibility, and accountability at this meeting by ensuring that the meeting is being live streamed, and a video of this meeting will be available on the district's website for viewing on an on-demand basis. Can someone move that? Moved by Councillor Anderson, seconded by Councillor Race. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries. We have some rules because we are hosting electronic meetings. Council members attending the meeting electronically are required to advise the chair of the meeting of the following circumstances. When the council member disconnects and/or reconnects, so that this can be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. Council members are to identify themselves when they advise the chair they wish to speak by raising their hand if they're connected by video, or simply saying chair if they're connected by audio only. With respect to a vote, council members are only required to state a nay vote. No statement is required if the member is in favor. Council members shall put their phone or computer on mute unless they are speaking. That also goes for our I almost called them presentators. Presenters. That's me. Council members shall be involved in and participate in the meeting. If you're having technical difficulties, you can text the corporate officer. And if we're having technical challenges on our end, we'll recess for up to 10 minutes just to get everyone connected again. So with that, this morning's meeting is really all about budget. So I will first turn things over to Hillary Bloom, Director of Library Services, for the library budget presentation.
Thank you, Mayor Elliott. I am going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint slide. Good morning, Mayor and Council, and thank you for the opportunity to present our 2021 budget requests to you today. My name is Hillary Bloom, Director of Library Services, and here with me today, 6 feet away, is our Library Board Chair, David Gayton. Mr. Gayton will be speaking at the end of our presentation. Before diving into 2021 and beyond, I'd like to share with you a few highlights for the library this year. While it's been an unusual year to say the least, we've taken the opportunity to take on several important projects. These include designing and launching a new website and new branding for the library, including the new logo you see here on the screen. When we began to restore services to the community in the spring and early summer, we took the leap to launch mobile printing and payment options for our public computer service, something we talked about doing even before COVID. Our takeout service, including staff-selected recommendations, has surpassed our expectations in terms of popularity and approval. Many patrons tell us that this new service has meant they're enjoying their library material selections better than ever before, thanks to our staff, who are amazing at making suggestions. Between running takeout 30 hours per week and being open for in-library visits 5 days a week, including an evening and a Saturday, I'm very proud of my staff for keeping the community connected and making sure that library materials are getting where they're needed. Our virtual programming has been very popular, and it's been a wonderful opportunity to collaborate with the other Sea to Sky libraries to deliver material and programming via Zoom. Whistler, Pemberton, and Squamish libraries are co-hosting an event with Bob Joseph on Monday night. Bob Joseph is the author of 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, and I'm happy to say we sold out for the 500 free tickets weeks ago. People from all over Canada will be attending on Monday. We were successful in receiving a UBCM grant to develop a visiting library program for homebound patrons, and a Squamish Arts Council grant to hire a Squamish Nation artist to design an art installation for the library's front windows. Both of these projects are currently underway. The library board approved a 3-year budget for the library at their October meeting. To give a bit of context, over 85% of the library's funding comes from the municipality, which covers salaries and benefits for our staff, facility costs, guard costs, and some of our collections budget, staff training budget, and IT costs. We also receive grants from the SLRD, the province, the federal government, and a few other sources. The library also generates some of its own revenue. In developing the budget this year, we did our best to anticipate what our revenues and expenses will be, as you do. We anticipate that we will not achieve our normal library-generated revenue in several areas that we rely on due to current COVID restrictions that impact how we operate. These include foyer gallery sales and fundraising, meeting room rental revenue, public printing and photocopying, and some other miscellaneous revenue from activities such as book sales. We won't be operating at 100% full open hours for at least the first several months of 2021. So one area that we identify as being a source of savings will be in our guard service costs. In order to address our anticipated shortfall, we would like to request that $20,000 from the library's funding for our security service be allocated to our general grant. In other words, this isn't a request for additional funding, but a reallocation of funds already earmarked for library operations in 2021. In addition to the request to reallocate existing funds, we have 2 requests for Council's consideration. One of these is for $50,000 for interior space improvements. As a continuation of work that began in 2020 and is continuing into 2021, that focuses on improvements to the public space in the library, this new project will address best use of space for the staff work area and the circulation desk area, with consideration given to appropriate physical distancing to ensure a safe work environment. Secondly, we are requesting a new structure to support our public IT replacement. Rather than requesting an amount every 5 years as we have done in the past, we would like Council to consider allocating an amount annually for replacement in the form of evergreening, which is a more sustainable model and has been recommended by the district as the best way forward. So to clarify, the second request is an annual amount to be begun in 2021 and each year thereafter to replace the public computers. Beyond 2021, our library board approved a request for a 2022 capital request to Council as well. You may recall last year in our presentation, we spoke to the idea of funding for the future in the terms of a mobile library. In a moment, our chair, David Gayton, will be speaking about some of the work that's been undertaken or is being undertaken by the board, but to look at this option again, we've renamed that concept within the title of Library Future Needs. As you can appreciate right now, it's difficult for us to think very far ahead beyond what we're working on right now, which is why most immediately we're looking at ways to make the very best use of our current building and layout. But our board knows that we need to be thinking beyond that, and to refresh your memory to the future needs presentation that we delivered in early 2020, we are very actively looking to next steps for what the library might require. So again, this request is not to be considered for 2021, it's something for 2022. And as the board continues its committee work, we will have a more detailed and specific concept of what that funding might specifically be allocated for. I'm going to now turn the screen over to David, Mr. Gayton, who is going to speak to our last slide.
Can you move that back just for a second here?
Oh.
Just leave it there for a second. Hello, Council. I just want to make a couple of comments. in regards to the budget or around the budget. First of all, let me tell you that the board is very pleased and proud as to the programs that Hillary and her staff have put in place in response to COVID-19. I think they have found a very nice balance between optimizing services, excuse me, and keeping everybody safe. With any luck, I think one way or another, COVID-19 will be finished by next summer. I think we're all going to be changed. We as individuals and our institutions, I think we're going to be changed, hopefully for the good. What gives us, I think, hope is that Hillary and her team are extremely resilient. They're extremely adaptable. They're innovative. I think that the library will be a better place when we come out of this, and that's thanks to their vigilance. Now, the board basically has confidence in them to look after the short term. We're looking further on down the road. As has been our wont, we like to tell you about the library and it becoming too small. I think the library, like a lot of our other facilities, including City Hall, are becoming inadequate. And this will certainly be more apparent as we come out of COVID-19. As Hillary mentioned, we did make a presentation to you about our future library, and I would like to just remind you about our vision for the future library. First of all, we think that given the future projections, we only need one building. We only need one library. There'll be lots of programs that will go outside the walls of the library. We're talking about a mobile library, but basically for a town of this size, we only need one library. It probably needs to be about twice as big as what we have now. We feel very strongly that it should be located downtown. It should be in keeping with the OCP. If we're going to build density downtown, then that's where the library has to be. We also feel very strongly that it should be part of a civic center. It should not be a standalone library. We would like to see this vision move forward, and we can think of all sorts of potential partners in this, certainly including the municipal council, certainly including the Squamish First Nation. I think the arts, culture, and heritage people would be interested. I think there's potential for private partners as well. Whatever, we see the library as being part of this civic center, and we think it's a very exciting idea. We want to be part of a place in the middle of Squamish where people want to come down. Now, we are realistic. We know this is not going to happen overnight. But one of the fear I have, and I think the board shares this, is that with the rate of development in downtown Squamish, if our vision is not on the table from the get-go, then the options start to diminish as we go along, certainly from the point of view of real estate. I think the other thing that we realize as we raise this issue again is that without the full support and collaboration, without the leadership of the municipal council, this vision is going nowhere. And in fact, we will just be spinning our wheels. So we do not want to spin our wheels. We'd like to get council involved in this vision. Okay, that's all I have to say. I think if you have questions, probably Hillary is ready to take over the screen again.
Thank you, Mr. Gayton. All right, Hillary.
That's it. I wasn't sure if you would like me to keep the screen sharing going or remove that.
think you can take it down. And council, any questions? Councilor Race.
Sorry, having difficulty unmuting this morning. Thank you. I was just curious about the revenue shortfalls that you mentioned. Do you have a number for that? Is that the $20,000 you're talking about, or is it $20,000 shortfall, you reckon?
Yeah, so yes, we, after doing our best estimates on what we can anticipate for revenue and expenses, and also being realistic and trimming here and there on our expenses to try to best anticipate some shortfalls, but without being too overly conservative and not allow the operation to continue as it needs to. The $20,000 reflects the shortfall that we anticipate.
And so what would be transferred to the 2021 budget then? Is that the saving on the guard, or I'm just trying to balance
Exactly.
those numbers off?
Yes, so currently the library is funded for a guard service that would reflect our normal full operating hours, which is 60 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. And so in looking at that amount, which is already earmarked for the library, we can feel confident in knowing that we won't be requiring that full level of guard service for at least the first few months of the year. So as an option, rather than requesting additional funding from the municipality, we could instead, we're requesting that be reallocated to our separate fund that's provided to the library, a general grant fund that normally is used for collections budget and some other regular recurring costs. So it's mostly just a distinction in where the funds are going, as opposed to additional funds being requested for that.
So just to follow up, so there's two $20,000 amounts here. One is the shortfall in revenue, which, if I understand you correctly, is being covered by reductions in other expenses, trimming things here and there. And the second is the guard 20,000 saving, which we want to put into the 2021 budget.
I wasn't very clear. So at the end of it all, after looking at anticipated expenses and trying to trim there where we can, we still come out with a $20,000 shortfall. So there is one $20,000 that I'm referring to.
Well, and let me just stop you there then. So how does that get recovered? Or how does that get dealt with?
The guard. The guard is covering the shortfall.
Well, we're transferring the guard to 2021.
To cover the 2021 shortfall.
So the anticipated shortfall is for 2021. So all of what I'm speaking to is for next year's budget.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Okay. So the saving in 2021 would be a reduction in guard hours, which you just reallocate. I beg your pardon. Okay, no, I'm good. Thank you. I'm fine. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, thanks. Councilor Pettengill.
Thank you. During the presentation, I heard a mention of some hope or expectation of being back to more normal things or historically normal things in 6 months. But is that baked into the budget, or what assumptions is the budget making? And if things are taking longer than that, does that mean more significant cuts to services, or how is that being handled right now?
One thing I didn't really speak to in great detail, which I think would help with this, is to make sure council understands how we're operating at the moment. So all of our regular staff are fully employed. What they're doing day to day has shifted from what it would have been doing this time last year. But when I mentioned the takeout service and some of the other ways that we're operating, it is fully keeping everyone busy. So even when I talk about how our in-person library hours are not at full 60 hours a week, our takeout hours cover a lot of those hours that we're not open for people to come in, but they can come and pick up their materials. Not to mention the the value-added service of all the background selection and recommendations that are happening. So when I'm looking at next year, and yes, it's really impossible to predict exactly when things might change, and they won't ever be back to whatever normal was. Looking at the past 8-9 months, I feel really confident in saying that people's activities, staff's activities will shift to meet what our reality is and what we can do and best do with our time. So as far as anticipating shortfalls in terms of, like I said, the one thing that I can sort of feel more confident about is that I don't see us opening our front doors, expanding those hours beyond what they're at for at least a few months. But then that's why also conservatively, I'm not suggesting that the guard service funding be, reduced by anything more than that, because it's really impossible to think beyond February or March. I feel like I went off on a tangent there. Does that answer your question, or do you want to follow up with a little bit more?
Yeah, I think so. My basic concern is I just don't want to be in a situation where, 6 months in, the circumstances are different than we had planned for, and all of a sudden the library needs some more money to just sort of stay afloat. Or
no, I feel confident in. I worked with our treasurer and our bookkeeper and myself, and really kind of looked at the reality and feel that we're being very conservative and careful in what we're putting forward, and not banking or basing our decisions on an assumption that by, say, July 1st, things need to be like this or that. It's still very much kind of knowing that the next year is going to be riding a bit of a wave still, but I feel comfortable with what we've put forward.
Thank you.
Ms. Bloom, one of the things that I'm curious about, we talk about the library not, that it will be too small at some point, but some of the new services you've introduced through this process actually expand our capacity, because people don't need to be in the building. They can come and pick up books. And so are you anticipating that some of those really well-received programs might continue even post-pandemic?
Yes.
Just to help with capacity?
Yes, certainly in the short term. Well, yes, I think things like the takeout service, like I said, the response has been like, it's fantastic that people appreciate it so much, not only because of the convenience, but the safety aspect of it, and then this value-added experience. So I believe that is in some form here to stay. And it means that in the short term, while our community size-wise hasn't completely exploded in population, yes, we can really maintain a level of service that will, I hope, meet the needs. Having said that, that's where I speak to in terms of the interior layout. There are things that could be changed to make best use of what we have. Our circulation desk is really big. It doesn't need to be that big. It doesn't need to take up that much space. And then we could have more room for other things. And when we first asked for capital funding last year to start this project, we weren't thinking COVID. But now with the filter of COVID over top of it all, it's more important than ever that not only that we have more space, but that we have space for people to be adequately spaced out. So it's, and certainly things like moving to virtual programming in certain ways has been great. I mentioned Bob Joseph. Having 500 people be able to experience that program isn't something we would have set up before. But of course, we have an eye for looking forward to resuming more in-person community connections. So we're not going to head down a path of assuming that certain things are going to stay as the only mode.
I also just wanted to ask Mr. Gayton about this idea of, does the library need to be part of a civic center, or can it be part of a civic precinct?
Oh,
so if the vision is to have a compelling downtown that draws people in, why does everything have to be in the same building?
Well, I don't know that it has to be in the same building, but I think adjacency is important here, and perhaps there's some economies of scale. We'd all like to go to a downtown square and be able to sit and have a cup of coffee or whatever. Not every library can have a cup of coffee or have a cafe, but I think you can share these sorts of amenities. You can share meeting rooms, you can share a lot. But I think the adjacency also has benefit to everybody who's there. And I think if you create a city center, it can be a precinct, it can be whatever you like to call it. But I just can't see building a library all on its own. We want partners. I think it's you have to create a situation that is a win-win-win sort of situation. And I think that's certainly feasible. There's lots of really wonderful models out there. And I think what we'll do a lot of in the next year is to explore some of these models, look at what would seem to fit here. But we don't want to do this on our own. We can do it from the point of view of the library. But we really need the count. If this is going to fly, it's got to have buy-in from everybody.
So there's some flexibility there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We're at the beginning of this, not the end.
Okay. Ms. Bloom, is there a commitment from the SLRD for to help with refurbishing the library?
I've been in conversations with our Area D rep, and my understanding is that there is an active process in place to look to meeting or matching funds to the district. I don't believe anything's confirmed, but we've been in active conversation about that idea and the commitment of the SLRD to support the library as its residents use the library.
Great. Because, Doug and I can make that an issue next week at the SLRD if that wasn't happening. So that's good to hear.
It'll come up.
Great. Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, through the chair. Ms. Bloom, I'm just wondering how far you got with the internal space improvements with the $50,000 last year. Last year, there was no indication that that would be require a top up. And so I'm just curious how far we've gotten and how much investment we anticipate making, given this is kind of a Band-Aid measure to get us through to the next vision of the library.
Thank you. In your question, you mentioned that last year there was no indication of, and then I didn't hear what you said after that.
No indication that there would be an additional request for funding in the subsequent year.
Okay. So last year when we did ask for that, we had earmarked additional funding towards a mobile library in 2021, which then we've moved forward into 2022. So yes, we didn't have it presented as a 2-year phased project like we have now. Partly that is because of the changes that have happened this year with COVID, that we now anticipate that it's really important to have layout for staff and that front desk happen if possible. The project for this year has not been, the project for this year has been carried forward into 2021 because we were limited in our ability to work on getting it completed this year. So our board has sent a letter to the district notifying them or informing them that that's required. So that's in process. I'm looking to Roland is here as well. He could weigh in. But so essentially, with the opportunity to have the 2021 funding of an additional $50,000, it then allows us to think a bit more holistically about some of these large scale changes, because as you know, our library is very open, an open space. And so we would look at it sort of as an augmented project at this point, as opposed to 2 separate projects. The staff area and the circulation desk and the public area all kind of flow into one another.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question?
Go ahead.
The chair. So just so I fully understand, so in last year's budget, the $50,000 requested for internal space improvements speaks to all the things that you have mentioned in terms of internal improvements, from modular furniture to improved staff work area and circulation desk area. That was in the 2020 budget. And so I'm just curious, has the project envelope for those improvements increased substantially now at this point?
So the 2020 request was specific to the public area. We weren't focused on the staff and circulation desk in that request last year. So this is, it was public space, and then this additional new request is for staff and circulation desk. So it has augmented the scope of the project beyond what we were looking at last year.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Councillor Rees.
Thank you. Just with respect to the $10,000 computer renewal program, that I take it as the ongoing one. You anticipate that for the next few years. How many computers or what portion of your computer stock would $10,000 renew? So is that like a third, and this happens every 3 years that you renew the same computer?
Well, yeah, so we've had 2 cycles of computer replacement in the time since I became a director, and it's been once every 5 years. So our computers to date have essentially lasted that long, but the funding is to, in part, to replace hardware, you know, the computers themselves, but it's also a lot of the auxiliary infrastructure around them. So essentially the approach is that, you know, rather than coming to you 5 years from now and asking for 50,000, it's been flagged as a risky way to operate if you wait until 5 years from now to replace all at once, and instead we should be rolling forward on that. So as far as what $10,000 might cover, I mean, right now we have 9 public PCs that we have available to the public, but the other concept that we've been exploring is the idea of moving away from that model and potentially purchasing a number of laptops that people could then use and spread apart in the library to use at their own sort of more spread out space. I don't have it sort of mapped out exactly what $10,000 would cover each year, and as technology changes so quickly, it's a little tricky for me to know what it will be spent on year over year. But I know that every 5 years we've been asking for this an amount to cover that. And in speaking with IT, it was, you know, definitely, as IT does with the staff machines, it's an ongoing replacement. And some of our machines have not lasted the full 5 years, and so we've had to sort of have stopgap measures to address that in the short term.
But more or less on a 5-year cycle.
That's what it's been based on, but like I said, I think if we just move to this annual, we'll kind of reframe the way we're thinking about that program, and maybe phasing out the PCs and introducing other types of devices as alternatives.
Good, thank you.
Okay, I'd like to wrap this up. Councilor Pettengill.
Well, just following from that, I'm a bit curious then, is this for all of the library's IT infrastructure, network and everything, or just the publicly accessible pieces?
Just the publicly accessible. The library staff infrastructure is covered within the IT department of the district.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Gates, as well.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right, we're on to our next topic around budget, the general reserve. I was turning it over to our finance team.
Hi there. Can everybody see me and see the presentation?
We can't see the presentation yet.
Oh, okay. Try that again. How about now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Excellent. Okay, good morning, Mayor and Council. Welcome to the first meeting of the 2021 to 2025 Financial Planning Workshop. For the public, my name is Heather Boxrud, Chief Financial Officer. I'll just start by introducing our presenters as well as the agenda. So over the next 1.5 hours, we have quite a bit to cover on the agenda today. We started off with the library budget, as you know, with Hilary Bloom and the chair, David Gayton. I will then now just present the recommendation on the establishment of the General Operating Reserve, and then on to an introduction of the newly announced COVID-19 BC Safe Restart grant and recommended process for that. At that point, I will pass it over to Roland Russell, our Senior Financial Analyst, who will be presenting the 2021 non-discretionary budget with a guest appearance from Conrad Cordell, the IT Director, to discuss some upcoming IT contracts. And finally, Mr. Russell will finish off the workshop by presenting the Solid Waste Utility Financial Plan. So there's a lot to cover, and there's a lot of information within each of those presentations. We'll just have a slide at the end for questions and comments between each of the sections. Oops. As a brief reminder, here's where we are in the budget schedule. So November, we're covering off the non-discretionary budget with the general fund operating and capital being brought forward to the next budget workshop. So December, we'll have the general fund service level change. We'll bring forward the utility bylaw for 3 readings and approval. The BC Safe Restart grant recommendations with a special operating project and capital budget workshop. January, we'll have the public engagement meeting, and then if all goes as planned, February will bring forward the complete financial plan bylaw for 3 readings and approval, and April will bring the property tax review and bylaw for 3 readings and approval. So before I dig into the next subject, I will just pass it over to Council for any comments or questions before we move on.
Don't see any.
Okay.
And we might take a little recess somewhere in there.
Perfect, sounds great. All right, so just moving on to the General Operating Reserve establishment. Detailed report to Council has been provided within the Council package. However, I will take a few minutes to review some of the salient points in this presentation. The goal of this presentation is for Council to approve staff recommendations for the first 3 readings of the District of Squamish Bylaw number 2788, 2020. Section 188 of the Community Charter states that Council may establish a reserve for specified purposes, and Section 189 states that money may be placed in a reserve and interest on it must be used only for the purposes of the reserve. So several best practices come into play in our recommendation today. The District of Squamish Long-Term Financial Plan, Guiding Principles and Financial Policy recommends the establishment of an emergency reserve for unexpected events that result in an immediate needs for funds. As well, the plan recommends the district maintain a target value of 1/8 or 12.5% of annual operating expenditures. In addition to the above, the Government Finance Officer Association of BC recommends using unexpected annual surplus as a means to fund capital expenditures that cannot be funded with existing capital funding envelopes, to augment statutory and non-statutory reserves where there may be a shortfall in those reserves, to reduce outstanding debt levels, and to fund priority special projects. So our current situation at year end 2019, the unappropriated accumulated surplus, or UAS, had a balance of 8.3 million, of which 6 million was being used to temporarily fund capital expenditures prior to issuance. This amount is a direct result of unexpected annual surpluses in general operating budgets, including attrition, unused operating costs, additional revenues, and special projects, and would have been built up over time. The recommended working capital, being 1/8 of annual operating expenses, equates to approximately $5 million. So staff are recommending that we establish a general operating reserve and transferring the full 8.3 million in unappropriated accumulated surplus to that reserve in order to fund in order to provide transparency and financial oversight of the unappropriated funds and unexpected annual surplus going forward. Reducing the need for temporary borrowing early in the year before major revenues from annual property tax and utility bills are received. Reduce the need to borrow temporarily between the Municipal Finance Authority spring and fall debt issuances. Provide a funding mechanism in case of emergency. Provide a future taxation stabilization mechanism to to fund special priority projects. As well, staff are recommending that this reserve be maintained through the allocation of unexpected annual surpluses going forward. So I'll just open it up now to council for any questions or comments.
Councilor Race, how did I know yours would be the first hand up? We're talking about accumulated surplus. Go ahead.
If I was a computer theorist or conspiracy theorist, I would think that this was an attempt to get accumulated surplus beyond my reach, but I'm not that kind of person, so I won't say that. But we've had discussions, actually I welcome this. We've had discussions around this before about putting some kind of framework around accumulated surplus, which is a significant number. And I've had this discussion, or council has had this discussion with previous CFOs about recognizing the part that we need for good fiscal management. In other words, working capital, short-term borrowing, bridge funding, before taxation comes in June, for example. And then the amount that we might use for other one-time priorities. And so I'm just curious about the first part. I mean, from the report, we just used $6 million of this fund sort of for bridge borrowing. Is that the number we should sort of keep in our own minds when we're trying to figure out how we might deal with this money? Is that the number we should keep in our own minds for, we don't want to touch that because it might be used for working capital needs? Or is there another number, or is there some kind of formula we can deal with? And the reason I say that is because, while I understand the fiscal prudence of this, this is also money that we have taxed for, and I don't want it to be dead money. It should go to some purpose and not just sit there. So we have to keep some in reserve. I certainly recognize that. But can we sort of put a little bit more of a framework around it?
Through the chair. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the financial planning overall with this reserve would be, you're looking at it through the 5-year of the ebbs and flows of what our capital will require, and phasing in that approach in terms of how we can phase projects for debt servicing. And we have other mechanisms which we can use for cash flow management. In terms of the working capital piece, the recommendation is that $5 million, being the 12.5% or 1/8 of the annual operating budget. However, we're recommending right now that we keep the full amount in order to build upon that working capital for further emergency issues, as well as because we have some higher level in the capital spend in the next couple of years. So after that couple of years, we would certainly continue to look at it as a long-term view and look at how we might have those ebbs and flows in cash flow and determine it year over year. The other idea around this reserve is to build a program in which we can use for special operating projects. So keeping that piece out of tax and using this reserve in order to fund those special operating and priority projects. So that is the goal of providing that additional insight and visibility into the planning process.
Thank you.
Follow-up?
No, good.
Okay. Councillor Pettingill.
So thank you. I just want to make sure I understand this. So we have had 8.3 million in the accumulated surplus for 2019. So is the proposal that we take that money and just establish it, formalize it in a reserve, and then it is funded, or do I have that piece right?
That's correct. So basically it's sitting in accumulated surplus, and in accumulated surplus, there's several categories. So we have the various reserves and provisions. This is what's considered unappropriated. So it's in neither of those. So this is providing a transparency mechanism and baking it into bylaw, where we can therefore see the amounts. And then in future years, as we might have savings that are unintended through attrition or cost savings or what have you, that can be then allocated to this reserve for future planning and use, rather than just sort of going into this unappropriated area that just does not provide that transparency and visibility.
So if I can follow up though, I mean, I would sort of presume that we would have some sort of plan around the reserve, know how much we need. And historically, since we already have enough to fully fund the reserve right now, we might still expect accumulated surpluses each year. And so if the reserve was already at the planned level, then we still have these accumulated surpluses. And in terms of accumulated surplus going forward, we're somewhat in the same position we are now from that piece of it. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it's just really trying to provide more transparency because you have continuity schedules that are visible, as well as you can have that control in seeing all the pieces and a mechanism in order to plan and use those pieces for special operating projects or capital or what have you in the future.
Okay.
Councillor Pettengill, it's the connection to funding our special operating projects. Right now, we tax for that, and then we also end up with a surplus at the end of the year that goes into this undesignated accumulated surplus. And so I think what finance is saying is that in future, we tax less for the special projects. We can actually fund them through these unanticipated surpluses that are going into this reserve. And I think that's the piece, maybe, Ms. Boxer, that some councillors aren't picking up on, the strategic nature of this move to take less out of taxation.
That's correct.
I think I confused you, Councillor Pettengill, but there's strategic element about this.
Yeah, no, I think I understand that, but I just want to be clear. We still have, going forward, we'll still have accumulated surpluses, which has been a concern, I think. I understand it makes it easier or more transparent to access a piece of that money, but I think I just need to sit on it and think about it a little bit. So I'm good for now. Thanks.
Through the chair, just a point of clarification that might assist is that at every year we will see our unintended accumulated surplus, and then we can allocate it to the reserve. So at the end of the year, that accumulated surplus, it would not go there. It would now go into this general reserve. If that provides any more clarity. So the variance is at the end of the year.
Which is different than carry forward.
That's correct.
Okay, I'm going to stand down for now. Thanks.
Okay, did I see your hand, Councillor Stoner? And then I'll come back to you, Councillor Race.
I was going to ask for a clarification between the difference of carry forward and accumulated surplus, because I feel like that might help me.
Through the chair, the carry forward will be then brought into a budget immediately, whereas this is the unintended surplus in a year. So it could be from attrition or cost savings that may not have a project attached to it, so would not necessarily be brought over. We could then use those funds in order to fund other future projects, but it's basically just trying to do a catch-all of these variances that come in, and then have a mechanism to which we can then allocate them to other portions of the budget, whereas a carry forward is an approved that's brought over, a project that's already been approved, brought forward.
So I'll just clarify that the criteria that we established at the outset of this year's budgeting cycle, where carry forwards would kind of create a seal of the envelope for the 2021 ask for each project, that is still being followed here because that's under carry forward. The accumulated surplus is different than that.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Councillor Ray.
Thank you. So the part that I didn't appreciate from reading the report was the idea of not continuing on with funding these special projects through the operating budget. And that, from my perspective, is a significant shift from the way we've been going for the past few years. We've been deliberately, if I understood the process correctly, we've been deliberately trying to account for that in our tax base because it seemed to be a relatively stable number, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 recurring, although they're all individually one-time projects. Each year we had a whole flock of them, which came out to that number. And so we were urged to build up our tax base to cover that going forward. So if we don't do that, it frees up, give or take, 2% of our revenue or historic revenue. But what it does then is it assumes that we're always going to have money in this fund to cover those types of projects, which seem to be, very valid projects coming forward each year, and we want to deal with them. and how do we deal with them. And so if we're going to rely on accumulated surplus, I guess the question is, what happens if we didn't have funds in accumulated surplus? Then we go back into the tax base, or we just don't do them. And so we're, in effect, we're shrinking our tax base by doing this. But the long-term financial plan also, from my memory, also talks about funding capital, some of the capital, through the operating budget. And so we've always been looking at these small one-time projects, which are generally capital in nature, but we're looking at them as a recurring expense just because they do pop up every year. So we're not funding capital now through the operating budget to that extent, at least. And so is this a discussion about that? I guess it inevitably is. So I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Ms. Bachman.
Through the chair, it's not intended to completely fund all of the special operating projects or capital at any point. It's intended to assist with that. So we're not bringing to discussion at this point the program of funding all of the special operating projects through it. It's just that this will now be the direction we can start taking in terms of relying on less taxation, a bit of both, and planning accordingly on how that works in that year. It's not to say that we're asking to shift completely to fund it all out of here, out of the general operating reserve, is that we'll look at a combination. And then we're actually accessing where it's prudent and where it seems necessary to fund some of those special operating projects as they arise. But it's not to say that we're going to shift completely out of tax.
Well, if I can follow up then, because that more or less is the way we've been operating in previous years, where something comes along in a budget discussion, we don't want to go to general taxation for it, but we think it's a good project. And so we decide to allocate accumulated surplus towards it. Mm-hmm. And we make those decisions, well, we've historically made them every year in the budget that I've been involved in. And so that goes back to my original point is, how much should we or might we go into this reserve to do that in any given year without prejudicing our need for working capital. So the working capital you said is $5 million, give or take, according to the long-term financial plan on present budget levels. But just recently in the report, we dipped into it for $6 million. What if we hadn't? What were the consequences of that? So I guess the question is 5 million enough given our practice, notwithstanding what the long-term financial plan says? Is there more or less of the accumulated surplus? Is there 2 million a year that we can sort of apply to necessary budget decisions if we see fit without really upsetting the rest of the program? So I guess that's what I was kind of looking for in my first comment or question was, how much is available for those types of decisions in a given year without kind of straying off the plan?
Yeah, through the chair, that's exactly it. It'll be part of the financial planning mechanism. So we will be looking at every year, what our needs will be in terms of cash flow and temporary borrowing. And that's where we can go, okay, we have an X amount that we can feasibly, and every year is going to be different, use towards special operating projects or not. But keeping that taxation base solid, but then using this to supplement. And it will have to be determined every year and baked into the 5-year plan as well. So it's like using any other reserve and how we look at that. It's putting that transparency around that fund. It's effectively using it how you've used it historically, just adding a layer of transparency and planning around it.
Okay, well, my final comment then would, as we go into a budget discussion, then will staff each year, would staff then have sort of a number in mind that Absolutely. We might be able to apply and not go further? So we'll kind of discuss that as part of the budget process then.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Anything else on this? Go ahead, Councillor Van Gill.
So, my understanding of a reserve is it's typically for, true emergency things or sort of something where there is a master plan and you're putting money aside because you know you'll have to spend it, and so you want that money sort of protected and planned for. And so it sort of seems to me we're combining a couple things and adding a new thing into this one reserve. And so part of me is wondering, is this, it better served as a few reserves? So there is an emergency reserve that's that, I don't know if that $5 or $6 million is in that one emergency reserve, and that's quite separate from something we're using as a tool for transparency and oversight for accumulated surplus that we want to spend on good ideas like special projects from year to year. I mean, it kind of seems to me, and I think to Councillor Race's points, that these buckets of money should be kept fairly separate.
Through the chair, yeah, I mean, that is one philosophy, is to reserve out in more segments, and we certainly could take that approach. We're sort of taking one step in that direction in terms of at least bringing it out of the unaccumulated surplus into a general operating reserve, so we can plan and use it accordingly. Yet there's nothing stopping us from creating an emergency reserve, but you can also just have a general operating that you have a plan around, and you could say that we're always going to keep within $2 million into our emergency. It's just further segmentation, but absolutely that is an option.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Race, I saw your hand sneak up, but you put it down quickly, so didn't know whether you had a follow-up or not.
No, actually, I was trying to indicate I'm fine.
Okay. Councillor
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you. Through the chair, I appreciate the additional insight, and I do think that this can be a very useful tool to formalize some of what it is that we are already doing. It sounds like it doesn't really change all that much in terms of our process, but it improves the transparency, which is great. I guess my question, just to follow up on Councillor Pettingill's and your response, Ms. Foxred, is there then some policy work that needs to go hand in hand with how we establish that general operating reserve in terms of what that base minimum is? Do we expect that to come back to council, or is that something that staff just establishes internal policy?
Through the chair, I would recommend that we establish it through internal policy. It provides flexibility and allowance to use, and then it would come through as far as the yearly use in the budget cycle. So we would bring it forward of saying, we have X amount in the reserve. This is what it gives that flexibility to say, this year we will require more borrowing, temporarily, because we might have influxes in capital needs in that next year. By securing it in policy, it could remove that flexibility when necessary.
All right. Is there a motion attached to that? There was. Oh, okay, we've got a bylaw for it now, at the end of the agenda. Okay, so let's move on.
Okay.
Do you want the safe restart then?
Okay, great. So this part of the presentation, I will be introducing and providing an update on the COVID-19 Safe Restart Grant funding for local governments. As background and quick summary, the province of BC, through joint federal and provincial spending, announced $2 billion funding, of which had 3 streams. So $418 million for community infrastructure, $1 billion for transit, TransLink, and ferries, and $540 million has been designated for local governments. The $540 million is further divided into 3 streams, 2 of which are application-based funding, so $15 million for development services, and $100 million for strengthening communities. And the third, $425 million, called the COVID-19 Safe Restart Grants for local governments. Of this local grant, the District of Squamish will receive $3.76 million, which was based on a $169,000 flat fee and then an adjusted per capita formula. The grant funds are required to be used to address revenue shortfalls, facility reopening, emergency planning and response, bylaw enforcement, and protective services, computer and other electronic computer and other electronic technology costs, services for vulnerable persons, and other related items. The funding was left quite broad and provides latitude for local governments to address any local priorities they see fit that may have arisen due to COVID. The funding is applicable to retroactive, ongoing, and future costs, and there is no deadline for the spending of the funding. So several 2020 costs were associated with COVID-19 recreation losses, redeployment costs, and additional technology costs that would now be eligible for this grant funding. And we're recommending reimbursing those lost revenues and incremental costs. Before the grant was awarded, several costs were identified and were included in the 2021 non-discretionary budget package being presented today. These costs amounted to $750,000, which were base minimum requirements to keep the service levels at status quo, and includes administrative and communication support, additional janitorial costs, council meeting support, and then transit net losses. Staff are recommending these costs are funded by the BC Safe Restart grant, so reimbursed. Or sorry, the 2021 to be funded. Staff recognize the value of prudent planning for additional initiatives for community benefit capital and special operating projects in 2021 and potentially 2022. And we're working with the communications team to leverage anecdotal community feedback received throughout the summer months on pressure points COVID has created, as well to leverage information from the budget survey, which had several COVID-related feedback questions. The grant spending plan recommendation will be brought forward during the budget process and will be included in the capital and special operating ask. And that is all I have, so I'll open it back up to council for any discussion and questions.
Councillor Ray.
Thank you. So one thing that occurred to me when we were listening to the library presentation this morning was they had a $20,000 shortfall in this fiscal year, 2020 fiscal year, but they managed to cover it off by reduction of hours and so forth. But that struck me as being the kind of thing that we could top up because we don't have to account for the reduction in hours. And that may reduce what they might want to get out of 2021 taxation. So is that the kind of thing we're talking about possibly doing here?
Through the chair, yes, absolutely. So that has definitely been flagged as one of the areas where it could look for reimbursement, both from revenue losses and any changes in capital in terms of space needs and you know the overall layout that they're proposing. So absolutely.
And then just to follow up, what about the balance? Do we have a sort of a destination for the balance of the funds? After you go past this 1.4 million or thereabouts, the rest of the 3 point, whatever it was. 3.7.
Through the chair, yeah, we're you know looking in the planning stage right now. I mean, there's certainly it's really new, so we were you know looking at where we can be, where we need our needs will be best spent, and you know recognizing that we're you know prudent planning is important, and we will be bringing it back, and then really looking at you know sort of those the community engagement pieces that we are currently aware of. So the anecdotal feedback we've received, the feedback we've received through the budget process as well, through the budget survey. So we'll be coming back with a spend recommendation. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, through the chair. Ms. Boxer, you mentioned covering some of the operational losses as a result of transit, but I understood that there is a third funding stream that is anticipated to cover that. So I'm just curious if we're planning on using this one or that one.
Through the chair, we don't actually have any details about that at this point. So this is flagged for one or the other. So meaning we're reporting on this. It's a balance they've given us. We report back on what we spend it on. So we would just shift. So it's just noting right now that this is where our losses would be. We would recoup them through this or another one, and we'd be tracking the balances of both. So it could shift, absolutely.
Councillor Pettengill.
Yeah, just wondering if staff knows this yet or has had the discussion. You know, we had I asked earlier in the library about their assumptions for the duration of COVID, and it sounded like they were not making assumptions on that. And so likewise with this sort of funding, are we presuming an endpoint and sort of looking at, well, how can we sort of spend best this money this year in the context of COVID? Or are we sort of assuming, well, this might drag on, and so we do need that sort of rainy day COVID fund because this might be the funding we're getting, period, from the province for COVID?
Through the chair, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a balance. It is absolutely, you know, a juggle between, okay, what do we absolutely need for this year? What are some community benefits that we can do? Where's some, you know, reimbursement? And then, you know, thinking beyond the year of it may go beyond, you know, and we might have to look at that. But if you're offsetting costs now, presumably, you know, we can then be using accumulated surplus or have other budget later on to work with. But yeah, no, absolutely, it is a difficult balance to get our heads wrapped around.
Ms. Boxford, there's a letter on our evening agenda from a young woman named Navneet Gill who was requesting covered seating. I followed up with her and asked her to ask her grandfather and his friends where they'd like it to be, and they said Stan Clark Park. And so, you know, I think that's something we've heard over and over again, is the need for safe places for people to gather through the winter. And I would hope that that's something we're seriously contemplating in a number of different parks or areas around the community safe restart funds, because I think it's, one, it builds community through the winter, but also, you know, for some seniors, they know outside is a safer place for them to be if they want to gather with friends or family. So I'd love to see that letter sort of drawn into our discussions for capital spend.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, for sure, we've heard that that information back from the community, so it will definitely be considered. I'm not sure, Natasha, if you wanted to speak to any of that at all.
Yeah, through the chair, we are developing a plan to propose the use of some of these funds for covered outdoor structures at parks and gathering spaces, as well as potentially public washrooms as well. So that is in development, and we do see this as a really appropriate use for those funds. So we'll bring that back in December.
And is that a short-term fix, or are we just planning like a capital project that would get built next year and would be around next winter? Like, I think people are looking for a solution for January, February, March kind of idea.
Some of the options are more quick to implement, and likely what we will be proposing is some of the sort of more short-term sort of CCAN type options that go sort of next to public gathering spaces to have a seating ability, and then also some of the other more longer-term larger structures at some other well-utilized gathering spaces. So I think it's going to be a mix. The short-term options, we're told, can go in very quickly in a matter of weeks, but of course there's other work that has to happen around that in terms of site prep and supply ordering and labor and all of those kinds of things. So we're not quite sure on timeline yet, but we know that some options are faster than others, and there will be a mix that we'll propose.
Thank you. Can I see another hand? Yep, Councillor Stoner.
I'm just going to ask a similar question around timelines. There's nothing that's preventing us from using this funding before the adoption of the 2021 budget, correct?
Through the chair, good question. I would, like any expenditure, I would say that we would have to have it approved through a budget process. In terms of new projects and new expenditures, regardless of the revenue stream. So without considering that, my initial thought would have to be approved at this point during the budget process.
Can we get more clarity on that from the province?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's absolutely local governments that want to spend some of that money now. And so how does the province want us to account for that? Because if we all wait till we approve our budget,
yeah,
that's like May for some small communities. We're hitting February, and some of the big cities will be done now, or in the next few weeks. So I think some clarity around how we can do that and get some of these short-term solutions going before the budget would be helpful.
Will do.
Councillor Herford?
Thank you. Yeah, in the same sort of line of thinking, we've incurred some of these expenses already. So I suppose we need to, through the budget process, account for this new stream of funds coming in. We've sort of approved some of that spending through the budget process last year, and so I'm curious how those pieces work together, because we've already budgeted for those expenses and we didn't have the revenue didn't come from its expected source. So I have questions around that as well, considering that we have already budgeted for some of these expenditures.
Ms. Boxford?
Through the chair. So what is certain is if it has been budgeted for, we are recouping lost revenues. We can absolutely use any of the recouped for budget expenses. What is not completely clear is whether or not we can use them outside of budgeted expenses. So that's where we'll get some more clarity.
Did I see your hand, Councillor French? No. Councillor Ray, oh, yours.
Well, just in the past, on certain occasions, we have had early release of funds, and it's a resolution that's required, to my recollection. So I think there might be a mechanism to get these monies out of there for specific projects that we want to do now, as opposed to wait till April for. It's been the same with some construction projects in the past.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions on this? Okay, so why don't we take a 10-minute break now before we hand over to Mr. Russell? That's where we're going next, isn't it, Ms. Boxford?
That's correct, yeah.
So it is almost 11:15, so we'll come back at 11:25. We are back and turning things over to Mr. Russell for our non-discretionary budget discussion.
Good morning, Mayor and members of council. I believe you can see my screen. I also believe that you can probably see me. I hope both of those are accurate.
So do we.
I will get started. I think I will get started. Okay. Here we are. So for 2021, we have a number of non-discretionary items. Key drivers behind this, such as net labor change. We have a list here. I'll just go through them and quickly give you a bit of background information on what they are and what they refer to. So the first one is net labor change annualization of workforce contingency review. Council, I hope will recall that last fall, actually early in 2020, I believe, they received a report on the workforce contingency review and approved a service level change to implement said review. And we added a number of positions in the 2020 calendar year. Those positions were not budgeted for a full year. They were budgeted in most instances for 8 or 9 months and will be brought on in a staggered manner. This $200,000 represents the additional cost in 2021 to pay for the remainder of the year. The next line, labor contract changes at 2%. We have a total labor budget of slightly over $20 million in personnel costs, wages, and benefits. And so when you increase that by roughly 2%, it's going to come out to $400,000 and change. And this represents basically the cost of ongoing contract negotiations and settlements with both our firefighters and QP members, and also as a result of that, the increases that are anticipated for the library and for exempt staff. Each year, as part of the capital process, we provide a 5-year capital plan, and within that 5-year capital plan, we have a number of items which are debt financed. And so on an annual basis, or more or less annually, finance comes to council with a list of bylaws that they are requesting to be approved. And those bylaws reflect funding of capital projects that have taken place and also future capital projects that are anticipated to take place within the next year. Once we have applied for financing, the financing has gone through Municipal Finance Association, MFA, we would then receive the money, and as a result of receiving the money, we would have to pay it back. When we have to pay it back, we then include it in our budget. So the debt servicing that you see here of $200,000, 220, represents just under, let's say, average basis, just under $3 million of capital spending. Okay. Non-discretionary contract changes associated with inflation. Well, the inflationary items here could be anything from hydro increases for street lighting, renewal of ongoing contracts, inflationary increases in supply costs, these types
Mr. Russell,
of
could
things.
you reposition your microphone just slightly, because your sound gets clear and then is a little bit fuzzy, and
Okay, sorry, is that better?
that's better. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So the contract changes related to here on this line of $285,000, they relate to ongoing costs. So primarily things like changes in the cost of hydro, changes in the cost of smaller ticket contracts that we have signed on an ongoing basis, changes, anticipated inflationary increases in supply costs. For the most part, this is made up of a number of many small items that might impact any given cost center, any given program by $5,000 or $10,000, but taken as an organization, when you add them all together, it's almost $300,000. There are some areas which have had some very specific cost increases, and so we wanted to highlight those because they are specific and they're fairly large. They're specific and they're related to a specific area. So, for example, the non-discretionary adjustment for the RCMP, that reflects the annual inflationary cost on our RCMP contract. It is based on 26 members. It does not reflect any change in the number of members. It is solely the cost increase 1 year to the next for, anticipated cost increase, I should say, for our RCMP contract. The other significantly larger item this year, which has been specifically identified, is information technologies non-discretionary request. And that relates in many ways to licensing commitments and other commitments that our IT group has had to undertake. And those, though there's a long list, the ones that we would like to highlight are costs included in this $175,000 approximately, relate to improvements that we've had to make for remote working. They relate to increases in our software that we've undertaken due to security concerns over the last few years. We've had a virus attack and a ransomware attack, and so we want to be sure that we have a system that is safe, usable, and as more and more people work from home due to COVID, it is more important that we increase the stability and security of that software to ensure that it allows us both working ability in our offices and also from our homes. In addition to that, we've had simply changes in costs associated with licensing. And that's one of the items that we will be speaking about shortly with respect to the Microsoft contract. So this is overall the number of items that we've brought forward and that we consider to be the key drivers of our non-discretionary costs for 2021. The approximate value is $1.4 million. This equates to just under 5% of our 2020 tax levy. I would like to now move on to the second component of this and have a slight break for questions. The second component, excuse me, the second component in non-discretionary items for 2021 are related to COVID. And these items are specific in that they have occurred and have been estimated for 2021. These are not costs that we would have anticipated to make without the impacts of the pandemic. So starting at the top, let's say, we have had a change in our recreation programs. We acknowledge that we've lost recreation revenues. We've also offset the losses in recreation revenues by reducing our contracts. So if we aren't able to put on a program, then we don't need to hire the contract instructor that would deliver that program. So we're showing both a reduction in the revenues, but also a reduction in the costs. This is the net amount. For 2021, we anticipate that that is going to be in the neighborhood of $300,000. For administrative support, we are adding approximately $90,000. And the administrative support that we're seeing here is this will allow us to add coverage for Muni Hall greeters. It will allow us to manage unforeseen absences which occur as a result of the pandemic or other related issues. It also allows us to provide greater flexibility for people to be here in the office and ensure that we have adequate support for people that are working at home. One of the other items is our remote council meetings. It is anticipated that we will have to continue to have council meetings in a remote way for some period of time into 2021. We're not quite sure how long that is, but as long as council meetings are taking place in the evenings and off-site and being shared remotely, there is going to be an additional cost to deliver that service that is not included in our existing budgets. This is the estimated cost of that. It's about $60,000. As a result of COVID, we have had to increase the cleanliness of our facilities. And to do that, we've increased our janitorial hours through increasing our use of casual staff. It is estimated that the tax-supported requirement of increased janitorial hours over 2020 throughout the year of 2021 will be approximately $136,000. And lastly, we are anticipating that transit will continue to have lower ridership, that we will not recover ridership to the extent that we were in a pre-COVID basis. So it has been estimated that we could lose up to a 50% reduction in ridership, and that is reflected in this transit revenue loss. These costs, commented on by CFO Boxwood previously, amount to $750,000. Originally, it was our intent to cover these costs through the use of the reserve that we supporting the creation thereof. And again, luckily for us, the BC government came along and decided to give us a batch of money to assist us in help covering it. So we anticipate that the COVID non-discretionary impact in 2021 will be covered through the COVID grant. We also would like to comment that when we're looking at the non-discretionary costs, we're saying that these are changes that do not reflect projects and do not reflect increase in services. And so those should actually can be contributed to through growth and assessment that has occurred in the current year. So in 2020, we are anticipating a growth in assessment of approximately 2% of our assessed value, will allow us to generate an additional revenue equal to 2% of our tax revenue, which is $600,000. Once we take those two items off of our overall non-discretionary items, we believe that the total adjustments before new initiatives equates to $835,000, and that is roughly 2.8 percentage points. And at this point, slide which asks me to pause for questions. I will do so.
That 2.8, just for clarity, Mr. Russell, is the revenue ask increase, not the tax rate.
That is the revenue. Sorry, that is the revenue ask increase. It is not the tax rate. That is correct.
Thank you. Questions, Council, on the non-discretionary budget items? Councilor Pettengill?
Yeah, thank you. Can we go back to the first table of non-discretionary items for a second?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Yeah, so I gather the percentages, that's the percentage increase relative to the 2020 total revenue. What I'm wondering is, do we know, like, for example, debt servicing, that $220,000, what's the percentage increase over the budget deficit or budget servicing number from 2020? And I guess where I'm going with this is, for non-discretionary, we're seeing 4.8 increase relative to the ask last year for the total tax ask. But I guess I'm interested in the increase generally per line item, and I would sort of, if they're equal, I'd expect 4.8% in each one of these, 4.8% increase year over year in each line item. But I'm assuming that it's not that smooth, that maybe in debt servicing relative to last year, we've only increased our debt servicing by 0.2%. And maybe in IT, there's been a 10% increase year over year. And so I just sort of interested if we have any insight of where we are seeing more versus less significant growth in costs.
Through the chair, I could answer. All right. Here to have. I can answer that in a couple of ways. I would comment that the 4.8% that we're seeing on this slide, that is in comparison to the 2020 property tax requirement of $30 million. It is not in comparison to our total revenue, which would probably be in the neighborhood of $55 million. Okay, so just to differentiate. When you're looking at the $220,000 for debt servicing, what is that as a percentage of our existing debt servicing? I don't have that number in front of me right now. I would suggest that that's probably around 5%, I believe, and I can look that up once I'm offline. I have access to that documentation. Our current debt servicing is in the order of $4+ million per year, so $200,000. Excuse me, $200,000 would be around 5%. The labor contract is about 2%, $20+ million in total personnel costs. You are fairly accurate in your estimation of the IT increase at $175,000. That's probably closer to 12% of the existing IT budget. And the $100,000 roughly on RCMP, our current RCMP contract, is in the neighborhood of $5 million. So that will be about 2% increase. Is that kind of the answer you were looking for, Councillor?
Yeah, thank you. And maybe a follow-up question. I guess in my mind, what is more important is the sort of year over year per line item or non-discretionary as a total is more relevant than the percentage these line items are to the 2020 tax revenue total. But maybe there's a piece there I'm not understanding. And I guess, my thought is that understanding the year over year growth in particular buckets of money is maybe more a more important place to focus. But I guess I'm not quite understanding the importance of looking at these numbers relative to the 2020 total tax requirement. And so wonder if I'm missing or misunderstanding something.
These are the things that we can't debate, Councillor Pettengill, going forward into the budget. So we're going to eventually see the operating budget and the special projects budget and the capital budget. All those things we have lots of discretion to approve or not to approve. What staff are presenting today are the things that are driving the non-discretionary increase in the budget ask that we can't say no to, because these are things we've already agreed to because of projects we approved last year, labor contracts, IT contracts. So these are things we won't be debating in the budget. That's why they're coming to us first. These are the ones that are foundational to any revenue increase we may require in 2021.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but irrespective of that, I feel like it's important to understand the growth in these areas, and it may impact future decisions, even if we can't change it for this budget. It seems to me that understanding is important, but maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
Through the chair, if I may.
Go ahead.
I think that finance could look into providing a little more depth into the percentage increases year over year of these asks. We had provided in the package that accompanied the non-discretionary piece, we had included a number of pages which outlined the annual cost comparison between 2020 and 2021 by division, and within each of those divisions by cost center. And I think while looking at those two, one could develop a bit of an idea as to which areas have increased more or less than others. If, with respect to that, there's additional information the council would like us to provide or develop on that basis, I think that we might be able to try to bring something forward like that.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a second look at those numbers, and I just want to make sure I want to make sure I'm understanding all these numbers, and so hence my questions. So thank you for your response.
You're welcome.
Any other questions on these? Okay. Is it time for our guest appearance now?
It may be time for our guest appearance. I'm not sure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a brief commentary on this slide, and then if there are additional questions, I'll certainly will let Mr. Cordell answer them. Within the non-discretionary items that we had shown on the previous slide, one of them is in IT is the Microsoft Service Agreement, Microsoft Enterprise Agreement, it says on the screen. And realistically, what's occurred here is that this contract renews in November each year. So we are asking for a 3-year renewal. And the reason that this is coming to council at this point is because these costs are included in and will be reflected in our 2021 budget as opposed to our 2020 budget. But we need council approval to sign this contract because it relates to multiple years and also it relates to binding, well, to next year's budget. So the ask here is for approval for our IT team to sign off on the contract with Microsoft so that we can continue our enterprise agreements into December and into future years. If there are no additional questions with respect to that, I'll continue on. And if there are, I will pause and Mr. Conrad Cordell could answer them for you.
Council, could you go back to that slide, Mr. Russell, before we move on? Any questions? So the province negotiates this, Mr. Cordell, for all local governments?
Correct. It's, I'm not sure exactly what the process is, but we all essentially receive the same pricing. It does change a little bit based on the size of the municipality, but this pricing is set by the province.
And then, so right now we use WebEx, we use Blue Jeans, and then there's also Teams in the Office 365 suite. Is there a way to sort of rationalize as we go forward how all of our licenses, like do we need all 3 platforms? Is there a way to use Teams that meets our security and needs, that sort of thing?
Yeah, our plan is to move the organization to Teams because it's included with licensing. It's a really powerful tool, and it really will help with collaboration. There's some other tools as well with Office 365 that are also synced in with Teams, so it makes a lot of sense to move that way. For council meetings, we may want to stick with WebEx. We can look at Teams, but because there's that public component to these meetings, WebEx seems to be a good tool, so I wouldn't want to necessarily move away from that yet. Blue Jeans, again, it's not a super pricey solution. It's worked well in the interim, but I do see us phasing that out next year.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Moving on then.
Moving on.
We're supposed to break at 12:30 so that council doesn't get cranky this afternoon, Mr. Russell. So just keeping that in mind since we have to get through the solid waste financial plan review.
Mr. Elliott, I prefer to present to a non-cranky council. I'm sure you prefer to deliberate over a non-cranky council this afternoon. I'll do my very best. Solid waste utility, 2021-2025 financial review.
We just lost your audio there for a second.
Sorry, I apologize. Within the within the solid waste utility, there are 3 components that we were asking for council additional direction on. One is the solid waste service level change. Service level change relates to creating a permanent outreach sustainability coordinator. This position, this position would allow us to It would work with companies to divert waste. It would allow us to reduce our residential waste. And through the use of waste diversion, it extends the landfill and reduces greenhouse gas. These are the rationales for wanting to extend this existing position, which have been project funded, and make that position permanent, which is what the service level request is intended to do. Within the solid waste utility, there are 4 basic components that we have: residential collection, an area in which revenues exceed costs; landfill disposal, again, another area where revenues exceed costs; waste diversion. In waste diversion, costs exceed revenue. So waste diversion is supported by residential utility rates in general, because most of the waste diversion efforts are aimed at residential customers. And lastly, the admin and financial components of the waste utility. Again, in this area, costs exceed revenues, primarily because there aren't any. And this is supported by both the utility rates, residential utility rates, and landfill tipping. So this is, to comment, this is a fairly standard funding mechanism within solid waste. A whole lot of surprises here. And waste diversion is often subsidized due to community benefit. So, that's one of the reasons why it's set up this way. On our next slide, we show the numbers associated with that for 2020, 2020 budget. Of course, because due to the nature of the budget, balance is to 0. In 2020, our projection for the year, okay, is that we will have we will spend significantly less in financing than we had anticipated, and that is because it was a delay in financing landfill vertical wall, and there, as a result of the delay in financing landfill vertical wall, our financing costs in 2020, our actual dollars out the door financing costs in 2020 are less than what we had budgeted. We budgeted an increase in cost reflecting a larger amount of financing taking place earlier. The result of that, we will have a surplus in 2020, and we hope to use that to offset the deficit that we anticipate will occur in 2021. When we speak about this deficit in 2021, we are seeing a very significant increase in cost of financing costs, and that is due to the completion of the vertical wall and the financing of the vertical wall. And as outlined in the document, what we are proposing is we have to repay the vertical wall over 5 years because that is the term of debt that MFA offers. But the actual facility over the landfill that we are going to recover the money over will be open for 7 years. So what we are recommending is that we use the reserve, the solid waste reserve, to subsidize that transitional funding, so that in some years we're going to be below budget, and some years we're going to be over recovered and will be above budget. And as you will be pointed out in subsequent slides, you will see how that ebbs and flows over time. To accomplish this, we're looking at some fairly significant utility rate increases between 2020 and 2021 proposed. For both the landfill tipping fees and the residential collection rates, we're looking at an average rate increase of something in the order of 17%. And we recognize that that's quite steep, but we also recognize that over time, due to the nature of rate setting within the district, we did not increase our rates over the first significantly over the first 3 years while we were building the vertical wall. So we were increasing costs and we were increasing our capital to allow us to extend the life of the landfill. We were not increasing our rates at the same speed to recover those future costs. Now that the landfill wall, vertical wall has been completed and the payments are now due, we have had a fairly rapid increase in rates. The numbers were in the 10% plus range last year, and they're back they're in the 15+% range this year. So that is to accommodate the fact that we've had a major capital project injection and that we are attempting to finance that. If we look at the residential rates, you will see the 3 rates here in a graphic for year over year. And as you can see, we've had a fairly low level of increase between 2015 and say 2019, 2020. And now we're seeing a fairly rapid increase over the last couple of years. If you were to look at our landfill fees, you would see the same thing, and you would see a fairly significant and steep increase over the last 2 years for mixed waste. And part of the rationale for the steep increase in mixed waste is particularly difficult to compact within a landfill. And so therefore it is the type of waste that is most detrimental to us extending the landfill's lifespan. So we feel it would be appropriate to increase the cost of that and either hopefully receive more revenue for providing that service. So that as a result of the increase in financing costs, what we're seeing here is a pattern where our expenses are going to exceed our revenue commencing in 2021. And they will continue to exceed the revenue for the next few years. They balance in 2024. And then after that, our revenues are anticipated to exceed our expenses. So we are showing a significant increase in solid waste utility rates between 2020 and 2021, 17%. And then to bridge this gap between revenue and expense in the future, we're showing a 5% average rate increase between 21 through 26. So in the years 22 onward, we have forecast a 5% overall average rate increase for the solid waste utility. And as a result of that, we anticipate that although we will have a surplus in 2020 projected, and we will add to our reserve, for the next 3 years, 21, 22, 23, we will have a drawdown in our reserves. 24, we should break even. And in 25 and 26, we will be replenishing our reserves. As a result, over this 7-year period, from 2020 to 2026, the net value going in and out of the reserves is 0. And this allows us to manage the overall costs of the solid waste utility in a stable and sustainable manner. We acknowledge that there must be a fairly significant jump at the front end to kickstart this program, but we think that this is the most balanced way for us to take on this challenge of providing a sustainable utility that is manageable both today and into the future. The long-term goal of increasing our rates and et cetera within the solid waste utility is to get us to the point that by 2027, when we need to open a new landfill, that our rates are at a point where they will be sufficient to cover all costs related to our current operations, plus the costs of the new landfill, including any financing costs associated with that new landfill. And the reason that we are presenting this proposal today is we don't want to see these big swings of high levels of reserve additions and then the need to have dramatic reserve draws. What we're really attempting to get to is a point in the future where the ongoing utility costs, ongoing utility revenues are at a level that will support the full cost of the utility, including all of its operating costs and its financing and admin costs in the future. So we wrap up this presentation, or close to wrapping up this presentation part, I will speak about the changes that we are requesting within the solid waste reserve bylaw. So within the report, we outlined additional wording that we wanted to use within the solid waste reserve bylaw. On this slide, we highlight the specifics and the rationale for why we are changing the wording we are. Within the wording, we want to add the term acquire to rehabilitation and replacement. As our current reserve bylaws are written today, they only contain the words rehabilitation and replacement, which technically does not allow us to purchase new assets with our capital reserves. So for example, in the 2021 budget, we are requesting an additional $200,000 for landfill gas flare. That is not a rehabilitation or a replacement project. That is a new asset. And in our current bylaw, we would not be able to fund that through the use of the reserve. We want to add operating projects, the term operating project to capital projects. Again, the rationale here is that we have ongoing operating projects that we fund annually. Normally within the utilities, we fund those operating projects through revenue, through our revenue streams. Given the magnitude of the increase in the revenue stream in 2021 for the solid waste utility, we basically pushed the revenue up as far as we can, but we need to continue with these operating projects because they are going to provide us with key information around how we manage the utility in the future. For example, one of those projects is the recycling depot study, and that will be required to determine whether or not we need to, in addition to build a new landfill, whether we need to look into building a new recycling depot. So again, we need to move forward and keep the utility growing and prospering. We need to be able to do these operating projects to make sure that we can manage the utility as best as possible. The current situation that we're in, we would like to be able to access the solid waste reserve to fund operating projects. And lastly, we want to add the term financing of capital projects to uses of the reserve bylaw. And that is designed specifically to allow us to fund the difference in timing around the repayment for the landfill vertical wall. So that ends the presentation portion of the solid waste 21 through 2025 financial plan review. And I would, at this point, like to open it to council for questions. Thank you.
Councillor Stoner?
Thank you, through the chair. Sorry, Mr. Russell, if I missed this in your presentation, but what is the reserve for the solid waste utility currently at?
The solid waste utility reserve currently has $1.5 million.
Thank you. And then just operationally, I'm curious, looking back at last year's budget, we added a service level change of a part-time bylaw enforcement officer in order to try and improve our diversion rates. And I'm just curious if that has, we've obviously seen actually a reduction in diversion, even though we've made that investment. So I'm curious if staff can speak to the efficacy of that bylaw enforcement position relative to including the service level change for the new staff member.
Mr. Wickham, who wants to answer this? Go ahead.
Sure, I'll take it through the chair. Yes, that's true. There was a shared bylaw asset for last year. We ended up with the bylaw team ended up being heavily utilized during the early days of the pandemic. And then, as I think council's aware, there was some turnover in the bylaw as well. So I think just in the last couple of months, there were a couple of new bylaw officers brought on. They're working very closely with our new sustainability outreach coordinator to really concentrating right now on visiting construction sites. So that's where that's really started in the fall of this year. That person is now available, and or people. It's actually all the members are cross-trained on the various aspects, and so we are seeing that support from the bylaw team for our outreach coordinator.
And one follow-up on that, I know we don't ever actually want to fund through ticketing and enforcement, but are we seeing any revenue as a result of that enforcement?
Through the chair, I'm not sure if they've started writing tickets or not. They've certainly been on site, and I have heard that they are seeing in a number of cases they are seeing diversion going up on at the construction sites. But I'm sorry, I don't know if any tickets have been written.
Ms. Golbeck?
Yeah, just to add to that, I'm also not sure if any tickets have actually been written, but if there have been, then the number would be quite low at this point because, as Mr. Wickham suggested, we are really just in the last month or two in a position to start these efforts in earnest due to the obvious pressures of the pandemic and staffing issues throughout the year. So our first goal is obviously voluntary compliance, and so it's the public education and voluntary compliance component that staff focus on first. So that's what they're doing now.
Councillor Pengil?
Thank you. Through the chair, two things. I believe when we had the landfill expansion discussion, I raised my concern about the idea of accepting as a base case the same per capita level of contributions to the landfill. So do these asks get us beyond that as a base case, sort of improve the base case? Or yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so either they're not answering the question because they didn't understand it, or they're not sure who's going to answer the question. So which one is it, Mr. Wickham?
Both. Could you please repeat the question?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, I have concerns in our landfill expansion and looking forward to the longevity of it. The comments was that.
Someone's got two devices on.
Mr. Buxton.
Can you mute Mr. Buxton?
Okay now? Okay, thank you. In that report, the longevity of the landfill expansion was based on the idea of a base case or a worst case where people keep contributing the same per capita amount to the landfill. And I raised concerns about that. And so I'm wondering if in this funding ask and the amounts we're contemplating here, if we're able to move to a stronger base case.
Mr. Wickham.
Okay, thank you very much. I totally understand what you're saying now. That was my bad. Yes, so I think one of the things that I personally really appreciate about the way that the finance department has put together this method of taking the 5-year amortization that we're forced to. You can only sign up for 5 or a 10-year loan. You can't sign up for a 7-year loan. But one of the great things about us using the finance department using the reserve to sort of spread out the amortization in this sort of artificial method to 7 years, that gives us that flexibility. If we do better than this worst case scenario, we have to plan for the worst case scenario when we're in budget season. That's what we do. We have to be conservative. We have to make sure the system works. But if the community does better than that, then we get to spread out that money over 8 years or 9 years or 10 years. And we get to delay the capital requirements for a landfill expansion by the same amount. And so everybody pays less at the landfill. They pay less for their totes. They pay less at the landfill. If people just chuck everything in the garbage bin and fill up the landfill, then the community is going to end up paying a lot more. So we're all in this together. We've all got skin in the game on this. And we'll be looking at this every year. We'll be revisiting during this budget cycle, and every year we reevaluate the lifespan of the landfill. And we'll be watching this very closely and reporting to the community on how they're doing and therefore how it's going to hit their pocketbooks.
Okay, thank you. I do appreciate the work that the team is doing. I still do have concerns about accepting where we are now as our base case. I think I am hoping to see something that has the base case above where we are, and then go above that if we really can. But that's maybe just me. I guess my next question is for finance, maybe. Looking through the charts, and this is maybe a request for future budget discussions, but on page 27, for example, of my report, the solid waste operating budget, I just wonder if there's a different way to present this in a way that sheds the desired behavior in a more positive light. Because when I look at this, I see diversion has a big red expense number next to it, but that's the behavior that we want to increase. And it's not just an ideological thing. It is, I think, an understanding that as we increase diversion, it actually has cost savings. But when I look at some of these charts, it makes it look like, well, that's an expense. And we actually see more money, the more collection we do, and the more we put in the landfill, that has a positive impact on our bottom line, which is not really, I think, the overall reality and not how we want to drive things. And so, is there a different way we can articulate some of these things going forward?
Through the chair, I totally agree with your comment and sentiments, Councillor Pettingill. Yeah, I mean, we want to promote diversion, even though diversion costs us money. So yes, it is a bit of a challenge on paper, let's say, to present this in such a way that it makes diverting waste from the landfill look like a more positive item from an economic standpoint. I think part of the problem that we were having, as Mr. Wickham had alluded to, is we spend the money on diversion today and we receive the benefit of diversion tomorrow by extending the life of the landfill. So it's kind of a timing issue. We recognize what you're asking You know, is there a way to make this look better? And we would like to say yes, but unfortunately, strict mathematics of it, you know, one plus one, so to speak, diversion does cost us money. So I think we have to be transparent in our approach to that and acknowledge that we believe we're spending good money, and that diversion is a very useful and effective methodology to keep our landfill open longer and reduce future costs. Unfortunately, it's kind of difficult to suggest that that does not have a cost to it. Let us think about how we can display the mathematics of negative numbers, let's say without using red. And then, you know, maybe we'll try to find another way to display that in such a way that it has a more positive view or outlook. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. Thank you. If I could just add too, when I look at some of the charts, you know, in terms of, we see how increases the sort of negative consequence of undesirable behavior in that your landfill tipping fees will increase year over year. We could also, I think, reframe that in terms of the positive, the savings year over year of avoiding tipping in the future. And so we can, you know, the positive results of doing the right behavior in the charts too. It seems to me there are some ways with at least some of this we can present it to encourage the desirable behavior in a positive way. But comment for the future.
Okay, thank you, and we will take that comment and attempt to deliver on it.
Councillor Race?
Thank you. And it's through the staff. Just looking at the first recommended motion, or the first bullet point about the service level change, and I'm wondering if there is a cost difference with that position compared to for a permanent position versus what that position is right now. Is it the same cost or a different cost?
Mr. Wiggum? Mr. Wickham?
Oh, sorry. Yes, what we've done for that is right now that position is a 2-year position. We recognize that it's extremely strategic, an extremely strategic position for meeting council's goals, and so we've proposed to extend it at its current rate. It is a union position. The annual cost doesn't change. The way it's represented in the budget is we already had it in for 2-year budget, finishing early fall of next year of 2021. And so the service level change has just a top up for that amount to take us through, and then the full annual amount starts in 2022.
Thank you.
Mr. Russell, is there any way to smooth the increase in fees from this year to next year? It's sort of, there's a big jump in your graph, and then it sort of smooths out over time.
Yes, there is. It would simply have us dip into the reserve a little deeper in 2021 than we had intended. We were attempting to try to balance the amount that we could contribute to the reserve, the additional contribution to the reserve in 2020 due to savings on timing of landfill financing, and use that to directly offset the amount that we were looking to take out of the reserve in 2021. If we wanted to smooth the rates, realistically, well, it would generate less revenue in 2021, and we would dip into the reserve a little further.
Mr. Wickham, do we have a sense of how many people have switched to a small tote? Like, how much of behavior change do we still need to do here? Like, it astounds me that people still have like large totes. when we have organics and every kind of plastic recycling you can almost think of and that sort of thing. So do we know?
That's a great question. Ms. Steglick is on the line. She may have a better answer. You're right. We have almost all totes are medium. We have a few large totes and a few small totes, but she would have should have a better sense of the numbers. Are you with us and promoted to a panelist?
Yes, I am. Thank you for turning that over to me. In terms of the, I can share with you that the number of totes in place were over 6,700 as it stands. And of those, approximately 200 or less are large size. So it's a really small percentage. One thing that I'd like to do would be to go back and to look at the numbers year over year, the changes in tote sizes from downsizing. That's something I don't have a handle on at this point, but is going to be valuable to continue to watch over time.
Ms. Steglick, do you have a sense of medium versus small?
Let me, as I'm opening some files on my computer to see what.
And the direction of my question is the last council, we always tried to keep the small tote once we introduced it as cheap as possible because that's what the behavior we were driving. And so to see it also go up 17%, granted it's a smaller number, so the percentage always looks higher, but my main driver is to really force people that are paying more and more for medium and large totes to really look at their habits and keep that small tote as attractive as possible for as long as possible. So that's where my line of questioning is coming from. So I'm just trying to get a sense, like, if we were already at sort of 85% of the way there in terms of small totes, I wouldn't be asking so many questions, but I don't think we are. I still see a lot of medium totes out there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. With looking at I do have the numbers at my fingertips now, and the small totes make up approximately 20%. And then, so let me just check this. 20%, large totes are 3%. So that leaves the remaining 77% that's in the medium size.
So I think that's my one piece of feedback on this is that I actually don't want to raise the cost of a small tote yet. I think we have so much pain, a little more, sort of turn the screw a little bit more on people who continue to ignore the organic bin, because I see lots of people not put their organic bin out, and sort of show people that if you want to save money on utilities, get a small tote and start diverting your material. So I don't know how the rest of council feels, but I am inclined to keep that small tote as low as possible for as long as we can, if we can support it in other ways through greater increases on the medium and large totes, or using a bit of our reserve to at least make up that difference for the small tote user. Councillor Stoner, did I see your hand?
You just had my line of questioning figured out, so I'm good, thanks.
Mr. Russell, if we wanted to make that change, would you have to take this away and bring it back? Like it would?
I would suggest no, in that what we had asked for within the report was a recommendation from council to include the rates in the rates and fees bylaw. So if you wanted to amend that recommendation slightly, let's say, to freeze the value of the small tote, you could make that recommendation and we would bring that forward in the rates and fees bylaw, which will be voted on sometime in December.
I suppose, is how do we cover that revenue that you were anticipating from the 20% of people that have small?
As I don't have the number in front of me. I would be able to calculate it, obviously. But as Ms. Steglitz had pointed out, it is approximately 20% of our customers. It's around 1,300. It's not going to be an inconsequential number, but it's not going to be a huge number. I would suggest that we're looking at I think that we're looking at a difference of about $10 or $15 per tote. So we would be looking at a number in the $25,000 to $30,000 range in all likelihood, slightly higher than that. I would think that we could push my recommendation at this point would be, if you wish to freeze the value, that we increase the subsidy slightly, to the tune of $15,000 or $20,000 in 2021, and that we reevaluate a rebalancing of the rate structure as we move forward.
So, Council, I'd like to make a motion that we freeze the small tote rate for at its current level for the 2021 budget. Seconded by Councillor Stoner. Any further comments? Councillor French? Councillor
Mayor Elliott, your point is well taken with me. I fully support anything that we can do to transition people to smaller landfill waste totes is exactly the direction that we want to do. And this is the kind of financial incentive that works for a lot of people. And so yeah, I fully support.
Thanks, Steve. Councillor Herford.
Thank you. And yes, thank you for bringing this forward. That aligns with my thinking on this topic. I'm curious to project out how much of a shift we're going to have from the in the categories from the large to the medium, and then the mediums going down to the small, and how we account for that through budgeting. But that's to the smart folks on staff to project out and make the appropriate adjustments. So happy to support this, and look forward to seeing the migration to smaller totes and thus a greater diversion. So thank you.
Thanks. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. That the small tote rate remain the same, remain at its current rate for the 2021 budget. Okay. Any other questions? Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, I just had one further point of clarification on the service level change request. I'm curious, as staff had previously mentioned, this is meant to be a bit of a strategic role, especially in the next few years, and we haven't fully rolled out what we were hoping to roll out in 2020. And so I'm just curious why staff see the need to annualize this as opposed to continue it as a contract term contract.
Mr. Wickham?
Sure, through the chair. I mean, to be frank, I don't think we're going to be done getting all of the organics and recyclables out of all the construction, all of the institutions in town, all of the businesses, restaurants, and everything in town in 1 year or in 2 years or in 5 years. I think that for our, both from a financial standpoint, as far as the ability of this position working, what this position does, I should back up, we've just been using the title, but as I'm sure council is aware, but anybody else listening, this is a person who is employed to spend the majority of their time out in the community, working directly with businesses, working on best practices for businesses and stratas, I should say, and institutions. working on best practices, visiting and ensuring compliance, helping and also cajoling compliance with our solid waste bylaw. 20% of our community GHGs come from organics in the landfill. Flaring that will help a little bit, will help a lot, but we also at the same time need to be getting the organics out of that landfill. So from a climate change perspective, this position is very good bang for the buck. But also from a longevity of landfill, this position could push out the requirement for landfill by landfill expansion by years. And I don't see this position going away, or the need for it going away in 2 or 3 years from now. So frankly, to be able to attract great staff and to this really key position, the ability to offer them a permanent position as opposed to a contract is key for us.
Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
I appreciate that additional information. I guess I'm just curious if in a year from now, what if we actually figure out that handholding and education are nice things, but what we actually need is enforcement, and we need to up. Like we've been doing the kind of handholding piece for a while. We've had a fairly strong target. So at what point do we realize that education and outreach aren't going to get us to where we need to go?
About 6 months ago, through the chair, or maybe a year ago. Throughout this program, we have known that enforcement was part of this, and this position works directly with our bylaw people, and we have a flow chart, I guess, of you get this many visits, and then you start seeing the person in uniform show up and ensuring compliance and that sort of thing. We got clear direction from council, I think it was February of this year, that council was comfortable with there being a lot of stick as well as carrot. And so we've taken that on board, and part of this position's role is working directly with Bylaw to provide that enforcement. But it's really, in our view, it needs to be both. We need to be working with small businesses that are struggling right now, and just to help them see how to comply and what the best practices are. But then we also need to be making sure that people comply, ultimately with if it's required.
Follow up, Councillor Stoner, are you okay? Councillor Race?
Thank you. I'm also having, well, I am having a little bit of difficulty with the first bullet point and the recommendation. And so I'm wondering if we chose not to make the change, does the second recommendation change at all? Are we changing the financial plan at all if the costs are roughly the same? And my concern is that we don't have results from this position yet. Staff have told us that already. Understandable, I suppose, with the COVID issues that arose. But personally, before I went long-term with this position, I'd like to know that this is the strategy that's working. And if not, then we might have to change gears. And so I would prefer not to make it full-time this year. I'm happy to fund it, but not make it full-time. And so really the question is, as opposed to the comment, is what does that change the second recommendation at all if council chose to go in that direction?
Just for clarity, Councillor Race, when you say full-time, do you mean you don't want to make it permanent, but this person's working full-time?
Yeah, that's the wrong word. You're absolutely right. It's just the service level change that's proposed, which is essentially going permanent from contract, if I understand it correctly.
Thank you. Mr. Wickham?
I'm sorry, I don't know what the first bullet point and second bullet point.
Oh, on the motion, in the motion in front of us, the first part of the motion is to approve the service level change to add the outreach sustainability coordinator. The second motion is then to approve the landfill rates for inclusion. So I think what Councillor Race is saying is if council doesn't approve the change, the service level change, does it impact the rate motion? Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Thank you. For 2021, there's virtually no change. The amount to extend this contract to the end of 2021 is minimal. It's in the $10,000-ish, $15,000. And so the 2021 rate change wouldn't really materialize. In 2020, compared to something like the vertical expansion or the extension. What they will feel though is that you know this opportunity to work directly with businesses and stratas is this is our one big idea. We tried just passing a bylaw. And saw no compliance to that bylaw without somebody out on the streets and out in the community, ensuring that we are meeting that. I don't see another way that we would see improvement. So I understand if council wants to have this position operating for longer, if we want to simply extend the contract beyond the end of 2021. And add another couple of years to it. I think I guess we believe that the benefit is clear of having somebody in the community working directly, and that's why we've gone for a full service level change. I think that we would need to see in this budget though, we would need to extend this position out at the least. To the at the least partway through 2022, hopefully to the end of 2022, just because of the budget cycle. We don't want to be letting somebody go in partway through 2021 and then thinking we're going to get them back partway through 2022.
Councillor Race, you good?
Well, just to follow up on that, so if we were contemplating extending this beyond 2021 into 2022, would that change the second bullet point at all? Would we have to provide anything to the rates? Because we're going to be looking at rates again a year from now. If we chose to do that, we could adjust the rates at that time for the 2022 year?
Yes, we could, through the chair. Yes, we could. I would just point out again that the change in the rates due to this position would be negligible. So okay. It's a very small drop in the bucket.
Okay. I'm good. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Ms. Steglick, did you want to say something? And then I've got Councillor Herford.
If I could take a minute.
Yep.
I believe the key points in terms of making this position permanent, one thing that really resonates for me is that as Mr. Wickham mentioned, it's getting food waste and wood waste out of the landfill and extend the lifespan of the landfill, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and of course, we're doing waste composition audits every 2 years to look at how our education and enforcement efforts are working. And so I think that the two things that are prominent in my mind about making this position permanent is that with respect to enforcement, the feedback that I believe will be received is, okay, what do I need to do to meet this bylaw? And that's where there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And that's where having the outreach in advance of enforcement gives people the information they need to make the right decisions and to take an iterative approach to be able to do the right thing. And then there's really no excuse for not doing the right thing when the information is laid out. And then the second piece that really resonates for me is that when we talk about waste composition, we talk about our priorities for zero waste. Food waste and wood waste are our priorities right now. It is going to take multiple years to really chip away and bring the percentage down that's going into the landfill. Once we've got a good handle on those, that's when we at the same time, we're focusing on the other waste streams that are still going for disposal. And, you know, provincial programs will change, regulations will change. We'll be modifying our bylaw as we go, as we move closer towards that zero waste. And so to coincide with that, we'll need both the enforcement component as well as the education component up front that will need to be paired with that so we can be successful. So I wanted to kind of put that on the radar. Bigger picture long term is that the education and enforcement, that's going to keep going as we move towards zero waste.
So this person's also responsible for our single-use reduction bylaw as well, and construction waste. So through the whole gamut, really. Okay, did you have a follow-up? Councillor Herford.
Thank you. Just as I've been thinking about this, I think of all of our bylaws, you know, being complaint driven, and to me, this part of this position is sort of making that complaint to bylaw. So I don't see, even if we shift to a shorter grace period and harder enforcement, we're still going to need to see have those eyes and ears on the ground to sort of highlight those areas that aren't complying, and thus where targeted enforcement should take place. So I tend to agree with staff on this one, and that this position isn't going away. Perhaps what they do on the daily and how much of their role is education and how much is eyes and ears for our directed bylaw enforcement can sort of evolve. I expect to evolve over time, but I don't expect the need for this position to go away. So I'm happy to see it be annualized, but whether that happens this year or it takes us a while as a council to get to that, for all of us to get to that understanding of the position in a future year, but I'd prefer to see it happen sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Councillor Ford. Okay, so we've got a number of resolutions in front of us. Unless there's any more questions, I want to start putting resolutions on the floor. So let's start with the service level change. The District of Squamish approved the 2021 service level change for the Outreach Sustainability Coordinator for inclusion in the 5-year financial plan. Moved by Councillor Pettengill, seconded by Councillor Anderson. Any discussion? Councillor Ray.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not going to support this. I agree with funding it. I don't have a problem with funding this for the next budget year. But so far, we haven't got any results. As I said, understandable, I think, given other issues that came up during the year. But I think I'd like to see results so that we can consider whether this is the strategy that might start working for us or not before I want to move to making full-time. I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're having a significant jump in rates this year, and we have to look at whether or not all of the costs are really justifiable. And while there is no difference in cost, I think the taxpayer is entitled to know that we're not committing to this person indefinitely, or this position rather, indefinitely. We might change strategies if this one is not working, rather than carrying on with something that doesn't work. So I will not be supporting this resolution.
Thank you, Councillor Rice. Any other comments? Councillor Stoner?
Yeah, I definitely am a bit on the fence with this one. Appreciate staff's additional context here. And I think one of the pieces that I have a hard time with as well is that we as Councillor Rice just said, we haven't seen the full results of this position that we put in the budget as a strategic initiative for the short term to try and get us to that 350 goal that we have both in the OCP and in our strategic plan. One thing that Mayor Elliott mentioned in terms of that struck a chord with me in our discussion is that the work plan for this position has also shifted quite a bit. It was responsible also for the amount of work that went into the single-use plastics bylaw, which I think also deviated a little bit from the initial idea of what this position was going to fall into. And so I think from that we can see that there's no doubt a need for this, and I take staff's comment that in 2 years' time, we're still going to need this, especially as we see our diversion rates this year have actually decreased. To me, that just means that we need to double down. So I'm happy to support this motion and look forward to seeing the results in the coming year.
Thank you. Any other comments? I certainly take the point of the fact that we haven't seen the benefit fully of this position yet, but I also think there is so much change coming, and I think this role can evolve. So we know that the provincial government is putting out single-use plastics legislation. The federal government wants to put out single-use plastics legislation. We, I think, have gone beyond that and see that the real strategy is actually about getting people to reduce their overall use of single-use items. So then we've got our own bylaw that will be sitting on top of those senior level government policies. Then we've got construction waste, and then we've got a circular economy to start considering and how we turn waste into a resource. And so I think, you know, this is where we need to put a lot of focus. We only have 20% of our population at a small toast. And when I look at our last waste audit, we have so far to go. And I think this position will be important to that. Any other comments? I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Councillor Race opposes. Motion carries. Next up, that the district approve the 2021 landfill rates for inclusion in the utility fees and charges bylaw, which will reflect the motion we passed earlier, obviously. Moved by Councillor Herford, seconded by Councillor Stoner. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. That council directs staff to prepare an amendment to the Rehabilitation and Replacement Reserve Solid Waste Fund Bylaw 2349/2014 by replacing Section 4. Moved by Councillor Race, seconded by Councillor Stoner. Any comments on that one? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Russell, Mr. Wickham, Ms. Stegler. That's a great conversation. Next up on our agenda, bylaws. First 3 readings, District of Squamish General Operating Reserve Bylaw number 2788/2020. This is with regard to our conversation with Boxrood earlier this morning, that we established this general reserve bylaw. That is moved by Councillor Race, seconded by Councillor Herford. Any further comments on this, Councillor Race?
Very briefly, I mean, I said most of it, I think, earlier, but I've now had a little bit more time to ponder this. And Councillor Stoner mulls things over, and I tend to ponder. But I think what this means going forward, and I was just trying to run it through my mind how it will actually work. I think it means that staff coming to us each budget year will, in addition to telling us what funds might be available for distribution, would also perhaps be able to sort of say, we have varying working capital needs, and this is what we anticipate for the coming year or 2 years. And so that is also going to be, in my mind, a moving number, and fair enough, as our needs move around. So, but certainly workable. And so I think this is a good step. This is something that I've always been concerned about. I've always been concerned about taxing for something and then the money just sitting there and not being spent responsibly. And I think this helps us kind of solve that problem going forward, and at the same time, practicing prudent fiscal management. So I'm supporting this.
Thank you. And I missed my opportunity to ask a final question on this, but in general, I support the principle. The one concern I have is that I do feel that the emergency component deserves its own reserve. And I am nervous about not having one, or having one where we've used up a significant amount of our emergency funding for, you know, as bridge funding and so on. And even though it's temporary, not having that there at all times as we see, you know, natural disasters and things pick up. I think an emergency reserve is a very prudent thing. So I hope this is an adjustment we can look towards in hopefully the near future. I will support this. I don't want to stop it based on that overall, but I would like moving forward for us to more seriously consider a reserve for the emergency piece. Thank you.
Sorry, Ms. Boxer, there's a motion on the floor. Any other comments? I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Did you have a comment now?
Through the chair, no, it was just a point of clarification. Just that this does not negate the allocation of emergency funding. It just incorporates it out of the unappropriated accumulated surplus into the general reserve. It's not saying to spend it. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Okay, before we recess, oh, there's a slide up here that says audience Q&A and council direction or recap.
Hi, I think you just did that. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Motion to close by Councillor Stoner, seconded by Councillor Herford. We will recess until 2 o'clock. See you
We had a whole hour?
That's what we had on the agenda.
So nice of you. Thank you.
Okay.
So are we coming back in the close then?
That's correct.
Close link? Okay.
Did we vote on that motion?
Yes?
You sure?
No, we didn't.
All those in favor? Opposed? It carries.
Thank you. So what time, I'm sorry, 2 o'clock?
2.